Hi, thanks for watching BibleMountain.com. In this video we're going to read from Exodus 15 and talk about God is a warrior. The conventional wisdom in our society is that it is not correct to think of God as a warrior. The conventional wisdom also says that God does not get angry. Also, because of our technological and medical achievements and accomplishments, we humans think we are very powerful. In this video, we're going to read from Exodus 15, and we're going to see some examples that tell us that these things are wrong. It is correct to think of God as a warrior. God does get angry, and we humans are not as powerful as we think we are. Now, before we get into that, let's establish some context on a map. The Israelites had spent 400 years in Egypt. Many of those years they spent as slaves. They probably lived in the Nile Delta, there within that circle. When they were released from slavery, the shortest path to Canaan, the Promised Land, would have been along the Mediterranean coast. But God didn't want to take them that way. He was afraid if they saw some opposition there along the coast, they would want to return to Egypt. So instead, He took them southwest into the desert. After the Egyptians released the Israelites, they changed their mind and realized they were losing all this free labor. So the Egyptians pursued the Israelites and trapped them against the Red Sea, somewhere in that circle. Well, God brought a wind across the Red Sea and parted the waters. The Israelites walked through on dry ground and to the other side. And then when the Egyptians tried to follow the Israelites, God brought the water back on the Egyptians and killed and destroyed the Egyptian army. What we're going to read in today's passage is a poem or a song that was written to commemorate this event. And one of the things that gets mentioned in the poem is that the surrounding nations heard about this and they trembled and were afraid. And it specifically mentions Philistia and the Canaanites and the Moabites and the Edomites. And we'll see that a little bit later on. Now, with that as a background, let's talk about Hebrew poetry a little bit. Hebrew poetry is different than English poetry. English poetry is all about rhyme. Roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, and so are you. Hebrew poetry is about repetition. A Hebrew poet will make a statement and then try to say the same thing in different ways. Or a Hebrew poet might make a statement and then add something to it, and then add something else to it. Or a Hebrew poet might make a statement and then say the opposite. And so there's a lot of repetition in Hebrew poetry. Because of that, oftentimes a Hebrew poem can be narrowed down to just a few statements. For example, the passage we're going to look at today can be summarized almost in about 5 verses. Verse 1, I will sing to Yahweh, for He is highly exalted. Verse 9, the enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil. The enemy refers to the Egyptians. Verse 10, God blew with His wind and the sea covered the Egyptians. Verse 14, the surrounding peoples have heard and they tremble. And then verse 17, God will bring the Israelites and plant them in the mountain of God's inheritance. So again, those 5 verses there more or less summarize the poem, the song that we're going to read, but those ideas are stated multiple times and stated in different ways. So with that as a background, let's get started with Exodus 15, verse 1. Then Moses and the sons of Israel sang this song to Yahweh and said, I will sing to Yahweh, for He is highly exalted. The horse and its rider He has hurled into the sea. Yahweh is my strength and song, and He has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise Him, my father's God, and I will extol Him. Yahweh is a warrior. Yahweh is His name. Now again, the conventional wisdom in our society is that it's not correct, it's not appropriate to think of God as a warrior. However, what we see in Exodus is that there was this conflict between the Israelites and the Egyptians. The Israelites were fleeing, and the Egyptians were chasing them to try and enslave them again. The Egyptians had an army, but the Israelites didn't. And God intervened and He destroyed the Egyptian army. And so that tells us that the term warrior is a very appropriate term to apply to God, because God fought the Egyptian army on behalf of the Israelites. Now let's continue reading there at verse 4. Pharaoh's chariots and his army God has cast into the sea, and the choicest of Pharaoh's officers are drowned in the Red Sea. The deeps cover them. The Egyptians went down into the depths like a stone. Your right hand, O Yahweh, is majestic in power. Your right hand, O Yahweh, shatters the enemy. And in the greatness of your excellence you overthrow those who rise up against you. You send forth your burning anger, and it consumes them as chaff. So again, the conventional wisdom in our society is that God does not get mad. But again, we see here in Exodus that God destroyed the Egyptian army. And part of that was his anger being expressed. And so it is appropriate to think of God getting angry. Let's continue reading at verse 8. At the blast of your nostrils, and the pronoun your refers to God, at the blast of your nostrils the waters were piled up, the flowing waters stood up like a heap, the deeps were congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy said, the Egyptians said, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil. My desire shall be gratified against them, the Israelites. I will draw out my sword, my hand will destroy the Israelites. So verse 9 is what the Israelites said, and verse 9 is what the Egyptians said. The Egyptians had an army, the Israelites did not, and so the Egyptians were convinced that they could easily win this battle. And so that's why they said the things that are mentioned in verse 9. They thought they would pursue and overtake and they would win. But then verse 10 begins to tell us what God did, and God blew, and of course God brought the waters back over the Egyptians and destroyed the Egyptian army. So let's read that in verse 10. And again, what this is teaching us is we humans are not as powerful as we think we are. From a human perspective, the Egyptians should have won because they had an army and the Israelites did not. But God intervened, and so the Egyptians did not win. And again, that's a lesson to us that we are not as powerful as we think we are. So again, let's resume at verse 10. God blew with his wind, the sea covered the Egyptians sank like lead in the mighty waters. Who is like you among the gods, O Yahweh? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in praises, working wonders? You stretch out your right hand, the earth swallowed the Egyptians. In your loving kindness you have led the Israelites whom you have redeemed. In your strength you have guided them to your holy habitation. The peoples have heard, they tremble. Anguish has gripped the inhabitants of Philistia. Now notice it says they heard and they trembled. The word peoples refers to the surrounding nations, and then it goes on to specifically mention Philistia, Canaan, Edom, and Moab. But the surrounding nations heard about what happened at the Red Sea and that the Egyptian army was destroyed, and when they heard about it, they trembled. And again, the conventional wisdom in our society is that God is not someone that we need to be afraid of. But these chapters here in Exodus, telling us that God destroyed the Egyptian army, teaches us that God is someone that we need to be afraid of. Because God is all-powerful, and he is capable of doing whatever he wishes. And these are written as examples for us so that we understand that even in our culture, in our time, we need to fear God. So again, let's pick it up reading there at verse 14. The surrounding peoples have heard, and they tremble. Anguish has gripped the inhabitants of Philistia. Then the chiefs of Edom were dismayed. The leaders of Moab, trembling grips them. All the inhabitants of Canaan have melted away. Terror and dread fall upon them. By the greatness of your arm, they are motionless as stone. Until your people, the Israelites, pass over, O Yahweh, until the Israelites pass over whom you have purchased. You will bring the Israelites and plant them in the mountain of your inheritance, the place, O Yahweh, which you have made for your dwelling, the sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established. Yahweh shall reign forever and ever. And then notice the end quote there. That's the end of the poem. That's the end of the song. Let's continue there at verse 19. For the horses of Pharaoh with his chariots and his horsemen went into the sea, and Yahweh brought back the waters of the sea on them. But the sons of Israel walked on dry land through the midst of the sea. Miriam the prophetess, Aaron's sister, took the timbrel in her hand, and all the women went out after her with timbrels and with dancing. Miriam answered them, Sing to Yahweh, for he is highly exalted. The horse and his rider Yahweh has hurled into the sea. And that's as far as we're going to read. Now again, the conventional wisdom in our society is that it is not appropriate to think of God as a warrior, but we see that God fought on behalf of Israel against Egypt, and so it is appropriate to think of God as a warrior. And we also see this concept in the New Testament in the book of Ephesians in chapter 6, and let's read verse 13. And this is written to the church, to Christians, to us. Therefore, take up the full armor of God so that you will be able to resist in the evil day, and having done everything, to stand firm. So notice it talks about the armor of God. And those are terms that refer to warfare. And the conventional wisdom in our culture, even within Christianity, is that Christianity is nice and sweet and is peaceful, and that's true to an extent. But these verses teaches us that as Christians, we're also at war. And we also see that in Ephesians 6, verse 17. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. So again, when it talks about the sword, that's a war reference. And so again, as Christians, we are involved in war. And whereas the Israelites were fighting a visible, tangible enemy, basically, the Egyptian army, in our day, within Christianity, when we are at war, we are not fighting an army, we're not fighting a country, we are fighting ideas. Our culture is trying to redefine God. Our culture is trying to redefine marriage. Our culture is trying to redefine gender. And there's other ideas that our culture pursues and believes in that are against what God teaches, what God believes, and what God has said is truth. And so we Christians are engaged in a battle over ideas, and we need to fight on God's behalf. We need to fight for God. We need to fight for truth. We need to fight for truth that has been delivered to us and is expressed to us in the Bible. So again, what we've seen in this video is that the conventional wisdom in our society is that it is not appropriate to think of God as a warrior. However, God fought the Egyptians and destroyed the Egyptian army, and so it is appropriate to think of God as a warrior. Also, our culture thinks that God doesn't get mad, but we see that God destroyed the Egyptian army, and so God does display anger. Also, as humans, because of our technological and medical achievements, we think we are very powerful. But when we read about God destroying the Egyptian army, that reminds us that we're not as powerful as we think we are. And God is much more powerful than us. And God is able to destroy us anytime and whenever He wants to. And then finally, all of this is a reminder to us as Christians that we are engaged in a battle in warfare. Our culture is trying to redefine God, redefine marriage, and redefine gender, and we need to fight for God. We need to fight for truth.